All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second week of the Introduction to Evangelism course. So, in this week, we're going to focus on the second model of evangelism. So, Pope Levinson, who wrote the book Models of Evangelism that we're using for the course, she called the first model the personal model of evangelism. And we talked about that last week. So, now we're going to transition to the second model of evangelism, known as the small group model. So, as she does in every single chapter, once again, but it's good to have that sort of repetition as we get into it, is Pope Levinson is going to go through the model and she's going to talk about it from four main aspects. She's going to talk about the biblical data related to it, the theological data to it, and then the historical data to it. And so, as we get into it, though, I want to go ahead and read her introduction to this chapter on small groups. So she says, pause now for a moment to think through the small groups you've been involved in: athletic teams, confirmation classes, science clubs, neighborhood watch groups, scout troops, Sunday school classes, youth groups, Facebook groups, bowling leagues, bridge clubs, fraternities, and sororities, political caucuses, fantasy football leagues, so many small groups to join. A few decades ago, a major study in the United States found that 4 out of 10 adults were actively in a small group that meets regularly and provides support for caring for those who participate in it. Directors of the studies claimed that small groups have become an integral part of the American way of life, even more so than the most popular television programs at the time, with the exception of the Super Bowl. And so the point here being is that everyone is already somewhat involved in a small group in one way or another. It's just whether or not you've used that small group for evangelism. So she's going to go on to say on the next page, on page 32 here, she's going to say, despite the preponderance of small groups in churches, it is uncommon, though, and I'm adding the though there, for them to focus on evangelism. So even though we've got plenty of churches that have small groups, not many of them focus on evangelism. But at the end of the day, here is the definition for small group. It's going to say that, in a nutshell, is the small group model, taking a well-known and well-established format, the small group, and setting it up for evangelism. And now we're going to get into why we might want to do that and ways in which we can do that. And once again, as a quick reminder, I just wanted to share my graphic that I have been using, for this course. Is she starts off in chapter 1 and talks about how she has organized the models from the most intimate to those that have the most reach, and the idea being that you get less intimate as you go down the line, but you reach more people, and then as you reach less people, it becomes more intimate. And so the personal one is the most intimate one of all of them. And now we're going to move into the next most intimate one that also potentially has more reach, the small group model. I want you for a moment to go back to one of the quotes that I read a moment ago by Pope Levinson, where she says, despite the preponderance of small groups in churches, it is uncommon for them to focus on evangelism. You are probably already a part of a small group in a church, or like she mentioned at the beginning of the chapter, a part of a small group in your life. But normally you've gotten into that small group because you and those people have agreed on common goals and common things that you want. And you're just wanting to continue to foster that sort of relationship in that small group. You're not normally actively trying to find ways to bring other people that are not involved in that small group into it. And that's kind of the focus of this chapter. Not how you establish a small group, but how you use a small group to bring in more people, specifically how you use a small group to lead more people to understand the gospel. So first, let's talk about the biblical evidence for doing a small group model. She's going to argue primarily that this is from the book of Acts. So she starts off with the Gospels and how Jesus had the 12 apostles, his 12 disciples, who he used and discipled them and then sent them out to disciple others. But then from there, she's going to spend most of her time in the book of Acts to say that this was not just a model that Jesus had, but a model that, in a sense, was followed in the early church. And particularly, this was followed with churches that met in individual homes. So she's going to point out in the book of Acts, you have a church that met in the house of Mary, the mother of John Mark. You have a church that met in the house of Priscilla and Aquila. in Romans 16:3-5, where that's mentioned. You have the house or the church that met in the house of Philemon, mentioned in Philemon chapter 2, the house of Nympha in Colossians 4:15. Okay, so then Pope Livingston wants to narrow in on Acts chapter 18, verses 26-28, when Priscilla and Aquila are engaging with Apollos. And so this is the story here. So he began, Apollos being the one who began, to speak boldly in the synagogue. But when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him aside and explained to him the way of God more accurately. And when he wished to cross to Achaia, the brothers encouraged him and wrote to the disciples to welcome him. When he arrived, he greatly helped those who through grace had believed, for he powerfully refuted the Jews in public, showing by the scriptures that the Christ was Jesus. Now, Pope Livingston wants to point out a few things. First, Priscilla and Aquila listened to Apollos. So they listened and heard what he had to say. Then she's going to point out that took him aside is not the best translation. She's going to argue that it more or less means something like to show hospitality to welcome, to just want to get to know better. So first they listened, and then they wanted to get to know him better. And then lastly, they taught him. And she's going to argue Luke phrases it perfectly. Priscilla and Aquila taught Apollos more accurately. Apollos taught the people accurately. Priscilla and Aquila taught him more accurately. So it's not that he was wrong to begin with. They just, in a sense, discipled him and made him better. And then they're going to throw in kind of these last verses here, because the reality is when he wishes to cross on to Achaia, the brothers encouraged him, the idea being the whole collective group. So even though Priscilla and Aquila took the lead, they did this in the context of a small group, is going to be Pope Livingston's argument, so that when he got there, he could now perform the task of evangelism much more powerfully than he could before. So from here, she's going to dive into the theological foundations of the small group model. And primarily, she's going to just argue that in creation, God made things to be a sense of small group or intimate. So she's going to cite Genesis 1, verses 26-27. And she's going to say, God said, let us make humankind in our image according to our likeness. So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. And she's going to go on to say, and to cite a scholar, Garrett and Congoli, and say small groups are microcosms of God's creation community. Whenever two or more persons come together, they become an actual reflection of the image and likeness of God. From there, she's going to go on to argue not only is this a part of creation, this is also a part of the Trinity. She's going to say, once again, citing a pastor friend of hers, God is a small group. And she's going to say the Trinity, God in three persons, reveals God's inclination to be in relationship in community. And then she's going to talk about a particular aspect of the Trinity, or one view of the Trinity, known as the social Trinity. And she's going to define it as this. The gist of the social Trinity is that the Christian God exists as three persons, hypostases, who are reciprocally interdependent, such that they constitute a single essence, ousia. And she cites Avery Dulles there as sort of her evidence primarily for that definition of the social Trinity. So for her, the theological implications is found in the nature of God himself, such that these are the reasons why theologically we would also want to follow through with the social or the small group model in light of the social Trinity and just how God created us to be in community. Now let's get into the historical foundations. So once again, she's already kind of shown some history of how this happened in the early church, and it would have been nice for her to go through some of the early church fathers, but instead she starts first with John Wesley, the founder of Methodism. So she's going to argue that he made a tiered system of small groups whose entry point was what's called the class meeting. And the class revolved around asking three questions. So the three questions were, have you carefully abstained from doing evil? And have you zealously maintained good works? And the last one being, have you consistently attended on all the ordinances of God? And once again, this is from John Wesley, directions given to the brand societies or band societies. And so she's going to argue that this was kind of that first sort of historical modern in kind of the modern age that led to this. And then she's going to kind of go through some others here. So let me skip to that, where she's just going to kind of point out more about how Methodists did this. And she's going to say things like, there are tons of mega churches in the Protestant model, but even they have realized, even though it's anti-American, generally speaking, for this sort of small group model, and she kind of cites here that religious leaders tore down small meeting houses and built larger ones. She's still going to go on and recognize certain churches like Saddleback Church, Willow Creek Community Church, North Point Community Church, North Point Community Church, and say that they all implemented small groups. And then she's going to end with talking about the largest church in the world. This is the largest Pentecostal church in the world for sure. And once again, I think the way you pronounce this is Yodi Full Gospel Church, which is in Seoul, South Korea. And its founder, David Yagincho, built it based on small groups. I Googled it right before kind of preparing this lecture, and it's got over 480,000 members that supposedly attend weekly in Seoul, South Korea. And she's going to end this section by saying both Cho and John Wesley, even though separated by centuries, language, and culture, nevertheless grasped the genius of the small group and its potential for evangelistic outreach. So that would be her two biggest historical models for how this could be lived out and how it is effective in bringing about evangelism into the church. All right, so now Pope Livingston is going to get into the practical aspects of building this sort of small group, or what you can do to make this small group model thrive in your church. So first she's going to start off with saying invite participants. And she's going to say, ideally, you're going to run into these people throughout your day normally. So whether you're at work, in the neighborhood, at the gym, at a favorite coffee shop, on Facebook, or any other social media site, that you're going to run into people that you can invite. And specifically, you want to invite people who are interested, but not identifying as Christians. Instead, this is going to be perfect for seekers. And I actually know a lot of people that kind of have used this sort of model to launch a church and to plant a church in a particular area, but then have kind of dissolved that model afterwards, because then the small groups transition into just being about discipleship, not so much about bringing people still into the church. Next, she's going to say you need to decide on a format. So she's going to give three main options. So the first one she's going to say that you can use is to just study the Bible. To just say, hey, we are going to just study the Bible. We invited you to come here. We understood that you were interested in the gospel, interested in Christ, but you don't really know much about the Bible. So now you get a chance to read the Bible for yourself with other Christians and ask questions that you might have. And that kind of transitions into her second model, which is just asking open-ended questions. So an example she gives is, what are common complaints people have against religious institutions such as the church? And then answering that question by saying, and she's just giving an example here, that these questions were same questions people were asking in the time of Jesus. And then from there, being prepared enough and equipped enough to actually turn to biblical passages and kind of guide people through how Jesus responded to these sort of questions, how the scripture responds to these sort of questions, and or how other people in the Bible dealt with these sort of questions. And from there to demonstrate how the biblical truth matters when it comes to engaging these sort of things. Then she's going to say another one is sort of a direct dialogue format on a particular topic in which the gospel can shine forth. And she's going to recommend doing something like having a film clip, a TED Talk, or a magazine article that you can then discuss and then try to make it a sort of Christian apologetic. And then from there, she's going to just go to saying that you could also just have a very basic curriculum about the basics of Christianity, where you would just talk through the elements of the Christian faith and why these sort of things matter. And specifically, you could also then, engage that with your particular denomination to say that in our denomination, this is our sort of faith statement. I'm Southern Baptist, so I could do something like, this is our Baptist faith and message. Here are the elements, and this is why it matters that the Baptist faith and message is designed, and the order in which the articles come, and what each part may mean in and of itself. Next, she's going to say convene the meeting. And she's going to say each meeting should have 4 basic parts. A welcome, where she's going to say always have food and drink, especially if you're trying to welcome people in who, once again, are not currently believers. A word about the format of the meeting so that everyone knows what to expect, and that kind of puts them at ease. A brief presentation, and she gets some, sort of criteria from that. And then a sort of interactive section where she's going to say, let them interact and tell you kind of the feedback of what you presented and how they felt about it kind of near the end of the meeting so that you can kind of go from there. And then she's going to give some pointers about this. She's going to say, eliminate theological jargon, minimize controversial and petty disagreements over non-essentials like infant or adult baptism. For her, that's a non-essential. She's going to say, rather than catching up with friends, spend time helping everyone feel welcome, avoid giving advice or bland platitudes, and take each person seriously, which means listening to them to find out who they are and how the group can best serve them. So ultimately, she's going to say, convening the meeting and all of this sort of thing is much more geared towards seekers once again. So lastly, she's going to say plan for the future. And primarily what she's trying to get at here is that at some point, the people that you're inviting should then be transitioning, once they've accepted and understood the gospel, into leaders. So she's going to say this is a proven effective strategy. Alpha, for instance, enlists new converts to lead a small group in the next go round. In this way, new converts transition quickly from invited participants to leaders. It is difficult to grow inward when every round of small groups is directed outward and led by those who have just made the transition from invitee to convener. This, of course, is the genius of a clear strategy undergirded by a hospitable invitation and a generous spirit of inquiry. And at the end of the day, her point is you got to partner with a church. A church is going to do the discipleship. A church is going to welcome in the newcomers. So she's not saying, if you did this to replace your Sunday school or to replace any other small group, but she's saying if you do the small group model well and you use the small group model as a method of evangelism, there's always a new cell, a new small group that's starting here. And she gets this sort of home cell idea from Cho, a new cell that's kind of sprouting off and making another small group and continuing to be more and more hospitable as you continue to bring people in. And then from there, you get into discipleship and you'll get into elements of theological conversations and debate and things like that. But that's not the way, in her opinion, to win people at the beginning. Instead, explaining kind of the bare essentials, what really is the quote unquote the core of the gospel, though she doesn't define that in this chapter, and then helping people to understand that and then moving them, into kind of doing this same thing for others that was done for them. And then later kind of following up with discipleship, not necessarily in that same small group setting, but potentially in a different small group setting within the church or within just the church gatherings altogether. Now we end with the appraisal of the small group model. At the end of the day, really the only bad things that she's going to point out is that if you have this sort of evangelistic goal, she's going to say that far too often when this does actually get implemented, the small groups don't actually do evangelism, even if that's their stated purpose, because they don't follow the practical steps or because of whatever other reasons, they just end up being more small groups that are just focused on discipleship. They don't actually ever really branch out and do anything. And she's going to argue that, in some ways this happens when it becomes a somewhat of a me first sort of religion, where she quotes this scholar Wuthnow, and she's going to say this happens when participants focus on how faith meets their personal needs rather than keeping the attention on seekers and their faith journey. So instead, she's going to say if the goal of evangelism is blunted or obscured, in the clear directions for conducting small groups forgotten, it is unlikely that the small group evangelism will ever take place. It is more likely that members of the group will choose the comfort of other Christians with whom they share common values and vocabulary rather than facing the challenge of discussing the faith with those who do not believe. Perhaps then it's important to remember that small group evangelism is not for everyone. It is not for settlers. It is for explorers and pioneers willing to do the hard labor of traversing the good news of the gospel with seekers. So, more or less, she's going to say the fault of the model is in the people themselves more so than any of the steps of the model, whether or not they're to the point where they're ready to engage and they're ready to seek out others, or if they're in a place where they might need comforting and quote unquote discipleship. That's going to determine kind of how the model works. So I do think she would probably say ideally you could have both going on simultaneously.